First, I appreciate the chance to give a quick overview of, oh, here it is. It was just hiding down there in the corner. Of our reliability assessment approach and findings and what it means and importantly what it doesn't mean. I think one of the things that's really important to know first is that it's not a prediction. It's a risk assessment. We characterize areas as normal, medium, and high, or normal, elevated, and high risk. It's important to note that we've had grid failures in areas that we consider to be normal risk. And we've seen high-risk areas get through extreme heat domes and cold weather events without issue. So it's sort of like going to your cardiologist, right? And they say, you're at increasing risk of having a heart attack. He's not telling you you're going to have a heart attack tomorrow, but it does show the degradation in risk. The second point I would make, and this is really important, and Joseph kind of alluded to this, we've been doing these studies forever. And for the most part, they were probably some of the dullest reports you could imagine, because they were great compendiums of statistics, but they basically said everything's kind of about what you'd expect it to be, which is pretty good. It was 2018 was the first year where we started to see a material risk of unserved energy, and that was in the California-Mexico region. And 2 years later, August 2020, Cal ISO had to interrupt power to about 1 million customers for 2 days in a row for a resource deficiency. And that's really unusual, right? There are times where you have, outages and so forth associated with, people driving into poles or storms taking out infrastructure. But to have a resource deficiency is really unusual for this country. Every year since 2018, when we've done this assessment, we've seen more and more areas show that risk of unserved energy and the seriousness of that risk growing until we get to the map that we have this year, which I'm going to assume that's the clicker to it, which, as Joseph said, shows a tremendous amount of red, which is our high-risk areas, a lot of orange, and a few areas that are still in blue, or in this case, gray. Let me just orient everybody to the color code. So gray is normal risk, not zero risk, but normal risk. And normal risk is that the system meets the criteria established by the regulators, which in almost every case is a one event every 10 years risk criteria. The orange is elevated risk. And elevated risk means that the area meets the reliability criteria under normal conditions, but when faced with an extreme set of weather conditions or other factors, but mostly weather, they would find themselves resource deficient or reserve deficient. And then the red areas are areas that don't meet the reliability criteria under normal conditions. So, for example, PJM, rather than a 1 in 10 year standard, in this case might be 1 in 7 years. So greater risk of finding themselves in a resource deficient manner. So that's about 2/3 of the country, of the population of the country, in an elevated or high risk area. Let me talk about the drivers of that, because this is what's more interesting. The first is load growth. As Joseph mentioned, for the last 20 years, there's been very, very little load growth in the country, and that's largely because of the money that's been spent on energy efficiency, natural turnover of appliances, that sort of thing. Certain amount of deindustrialization that occurred in the late 90s and 2000s. But over the last 4 years, every year that we've added up the utilities load forecasts, they've been much higher. And it's driven by a number of things. Data centers are obviously a big part of this, but it's also reindustrialization, bringing back manufacturing to the country. It's population migration. And in some cases, it's energy policy, the push towards electrifying transportation, electrifying buildings, space heating, and the like. So we've seen a secular increase in load that the grid has to be able to absorb. I'd also make the point that this doesn't include everything. Right? We ask the utilities when they give us their numbers not to report everything that might come on the grid, but quality control it, right? You give us the stuff that you think is really going to be there. So this represents about half of the data, a third to half of the data centers that are being talked about, which is probably the biggest source of uncertainty right now. The rest of it's fairly macroeconomic driven load growth. The second issue going on is the change in the resource base. I will make one other point about load growth. It's faster in the winter than in the summer. And that's being driven, again, by building electrification and also the deployment of behind-the-meter generation like solar panels, right, where that suppresses the summer load, but you don't really get as much benefit out of those in the winter. So we're seeing higher growth in the winter than we do in the summer, and that's really important because winter outages are much more difficult to deal with than summer outages, and they're much more consequential to the population. But you can see a couple things on that middle chart. One is the gray area, which is basically the dispatchable generation or the firm generation on the system. So the coal and gas. You can see over the next 10 years that its percentage as a total of the resource mix declines. And that's not surprising because almost all of the resources that are in the interconnection queues to come on, the vast majority, are wind, solar, and batteries. As I said, those resources are terrific in the summer, particularly solar in areas with high solar radiation. Batteries help quite a bit to keep the grid stable and to deal with the afternoon ramps associated with solar dropping off in the afternoon. They don't do much for you in the winter, though, because the issue is the winter has two peaks, typically at 6 in the morning and at 7 at night. And at that point in time, the sun's not shining. So one of the real challenges we see going forward as we add more and more solar to the system, which is probably the cheapest resource to add to the system right now, is that it doesn't really help us out in the winter. We're also seeing a general decline in dispatchable capacity in the plans. And that's important because the other issue with wind and solar is you got to firm it up. You can firm it up with batteries for a few hours, but most batteries operate on 2 to 3, 4-hour time frames. So it doesn't get you through the evening. It doesn't get you through a week of cloud cover. It doesn't get you through a major wind drought. So that dispatchable capacity remains very, very important. The other issue with renewables, or what we'll call inverter-based generation, is that inverters don't naturally create the reliability services that are so important to keep the grid stable. They generally do not create frequency, they do not create voltage, and they have dispatchability issues. If you tear apart the blackout that occurred in Spain and Portugal last year, a big chunk of that was because they didn't have enough reactive power on the system to maintain voltage, and the system got away from the operator. So those reliability services are very, very important. And then the other point to make in the last chart here is that supply is basically not keeping up with load. So we're going to add about 250 gigawatts of new load over the next 10 years. Again, based on the numbers that we've collected. Only about 70 gigawatts of new generation would be in what we would call high likelihood of showing up, meaning that they're either approved or they have a high degree of, they're in advanced development to come on. The other point I would make is that the numbers are a little curious because they just happen to match that. Of the new generation that's coming on, about 70 gigawatts of that is what we would call firm dispatchable generation, and the balance would be intermittent. So again, that creates all sorts of risk issues as we go forward. The other point I would make about new generation build is that the history over the last 5 or 6 years is that plans don't get met. Typically, fewer amounts of resources come on the system than are planned. So not only are we not planning enough to be able to meet the load, the likelihood of those resources showing up on time is also somewhat questionable. We've taken some hits on social media. For any of you who follow LinkedIn on this report around our treatment of a number of projects in the MISO area called the ERAS projects, which we think are very good projects, by the way. There are a number of reasons why we don't count them in this assessment. First of all, they were late, because anytime you do an assessment, right, you have to kind of have a cutoff date. Our data here is generally vintaged around July last year. Those projects came in the September timeframe. The second point, and the more important point, is that we haven't had a chance to model them yet because it's not clear how much they will actually contribute to being able to meet peak load. And we won't know that until we know where they are, what the deliverability of them will be to load, and we also don't know what their fuel situation is. So if they're natural gas plants and they don't have a firm gas contract, they may not be able to help you meet peak load under an extreme weather event. So there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done around those. I think, but I do want to go on the record, I think they're great projects, and I really applaud FERC and the ISOs. PJM and MISO have a similar process underway to expedite bringing resources through their study process, and that's terrific. Very, very positive news, but we still have some work to do before we're ready to declare them real. So let me hit one last chart, and then I'll take some questions to get out of the way. So what should people take away from this? Well, first of all, there are a bunch of very familiar issues that we've been talking about for the last 7 or 8 years. First of all, extreme weather continues to be a real issue, right? Whether it's the massive winter storms like we had in January, the persistent heat domes that we've seen in the summer. Extreme weather is with us, and it's important to know that extreme is extreme, not rare, because they seem to be happening pretty much every summer and at least every other year. In the winter, we get a really bad cold event. We still see significant retirements of traditional generation, coal, older oil and gas, some nuclear facilities. And the reason that's a problem is because those facilities make electricity the old-fashioned way, right? You boil water, you make something spin, and you get all sorts of great products out of that. You get kilowatt hours, but you also get voltage and frequency and a high degree of controllability. So the loss of those resources is really very, very material from a reliability perspective, and they're being replaced with resources that don't have those same characteristics, and those characteristics are very, very important. I made the point about load growth and winter loads growing faster than summer, something really to keep your eye on as we think about the resource mix and how we're going to meet growing winter loads. We have this issue right now with what we call large loads. That's code for the data centers, the 250 gigawatt plus single undiversified electronic loads. We need to figure out how to get those onto the grid and integrated in a way that supports reliability. The other point is that our dependence on natural gas continues to evolve. And this is really, really important. We used to always think of the natural gas issue as the 4 or 5 days in the winter when it's really, really cold. We're now seeing issues with natural gas in the summer and in the shoulders. And a big chunk of that's due to the intermittency of the generation that's being added to the grid. Something needs to back that up. More often than not, that's natural gas. But the natural gas system was built to serve very steady loads, and it wasn't designed to serve loads like this. So if any of you have seen the National Petroleum Council study that was published last December, right, they highlight this issue of really the need for better integrated planning between the two systems and the need for a lot more storage in the system to be the shock absorber between the volatility of electric takes and the way the pipeline system operates. There are some bright spots. We have seen a number of people who had plans to retire plants to defer those. Those deferrals are typically only for 2 or 3 years, though, not like we're going to repower a facility or we're going to really invest to make it a quality facility for the next 10 to 15 years. But the retirements help, or the deferrals help. We do see the electric and gas sectors leaning in more on the coordination issues we've talked about between the two sectors. They are still troubled by the fact that the two sectors operate under entirely different bases. You know, electricity operates on a reliability basis, gas operates on a commercial basis, and there's only so much you can do to reconcile those two issues. But I got to give credit to both sectors for trying to figure out how to make this work within the constructs that they operate. We've recently expanded our IBR registration, inverter-based resources, to bring more of them under the requirements that we've established. FERC has approved most of the requirements around inverter-based generation. So we think some of the issues we've seen in places like West Texas, Utah, California, where you get this common mode reaction from large numbers of inverters at the same time, we think we've got that addressed to some extent. The other point I would make, and I made the point about batteries, if you look at California, they have a large number of synchronous condensers, and they're making a real difference in terms of being able to keep the grid operating stably in the context of a highly inverter-based generation fleet. So we're very excited about what's going on there. We have concerns about how rapidly we can scale that across the rest of the system. And really, you know, if I went back to my 2018, if I were going to tell somebody, here's what you need to do, those things haven't really changed that much, right? The first one is we need to figure out how to build stuff. And, you know, the problem we have now is that a large load, a data center, can be developed and put in place in 18 to 24 months. It probably takes 7 to 8 years to get a natural gas plant sited and built. And that's assuming that you have rights to the turbine, which is there's a big supply chain issue there, and 15 to 20 years to get a transmission line built of any scale and length. So we got to compress those time frames to be much more consistent with the loads that are coming online. We need this one is new. We need to get the large load interconnection requirements in place. We're working on our piece of that, and I know everyone else is working on their pieces as well. But that's an urgent here and now issue to get that figured out. We really need to improve the situation awareness between the electric and gas sectors, because that's becoming ever more critical to our ability to run the grid in tandem. The preservation of reliability services, voltage control, reactive power, frequency response for frequency management, dispatchability, all of those things we need to be keeping an eye on. Because as we continue to lose the resources that naturally provide that, we got to make sure we got something coming up behind to do that. Right now, that's all done through natural gas. Or for the vast majority of that's done through natural gas. So the natural gas system continues to be highly critical to running a secure and reliable electric system. And then the million-dollar question here is going to be around technology, right? Are we going to be able to figure out a way to develop and scale nuclear, whether it's large AP1000 units like we build in Georgia, or some of the small modular reactors, but we can't get those online fast enough. In my judgment. And the other, magic technology here that'll make a difference is long-duration energy storage. And unfortunately, right now, when you talk long-duration storage, people will talk about 8 to 10 hours, which is long relative to the batteries we have on the grid now, but we need days and, maybe eventually weeks. And it needs to be able to scale to an amazing level. So that's basically what the report says. Joseph, I'd be happy to fend off questions or get out of your hair, whatever you'd like to do.
Here, I'll come over here. Jim, you can stay at the podium. We can take a couple questions. Oh, excuse me. We can take a couple questions from the room. We have a wandering mic. I would just, we got, Jim for about 5-6 more minutes. And so, Jan, you can go first. While Jan's getting queued, Jim, I have a question for you on sort of the long-term reliability of the U.S. electric grid. And, over the last 50 years, let's say, energy prices haven't gone up too much compared to inflation. In fact, have fallen for a lot of people. And reliability really has improved up until the recent period. Have we been underinvesting in reliability in a way that we need to really rethink, or are we sort of managing the problem at the edges? Right? It's implicit in there is a sort of like, you're either optimizing for reliability or optimizing for cost. Maybe that's wrong.
Well, and obviously you got to balance the two, right? I mean, forever the energy sector has tried to figure out how to balance affordability, reliability, and sustainability. Because all three of those are important dimensions. And when we get in trouble is when we emphasize one, because it's to the detriment of the other two. The main point I would make is that we developed the vast majority of the grid we have today in the 1950s and 60s with the rapid industrialization of the country, kind of post-World War II. And we've been living off those assets. We have a unique opportunity right now with the data center development, and an extraordinary, push on industrialization, on another wave of industrialization. This one's very different than what we had in the post-World War II area, but in terms of magnitude, it's very similar. And so one of the questions that I always kind of puzzle over is how do we leverage the opportunity associated with these large loads coming onto the system, not only to serve them and to serve the products that they're going to make, but also to broadly better society. And I think there has to be a way through that. Yeah. And in the case of, one great case here is the state of Georgia, right, where I heard 2 weeks ago from Kim Green, the CEO of Georgia Power, that in the deals that they've struck with large loads coming onto the Georgia system, they're paying their fair share and a little extra, right? So they're able to actually give some rebates or rate reductions to other customers, again, because of their ability to serve these large loads. And their main objective is speed, right? Getting it on the market. So if you're in a position where you can get them connected quickly, you can do some things on the economics that seem to be very beneficial for society.
Okay, excellent. Gun, go ahead.
I'm Alan Mayers with Resources for the Future. Where does geothermal fit in your picture?
It's a great question. I don't have a breakout of the new resource additions or the existing resource additions, but to the extent that there are geothermal projects that, again, would meet our criteria of being real, they would be included in here.
Do you show any in your calculations for the 30 to 35 time frame?
Our calculations go out to 35.
No, but do you have geothermal in it?
Whatever's in the queue to be developed would be in there.
So maximally, it'll be new add will be a gigawatt or two.
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but
yep.
Hey, Tim Fox, Clearview Energy Partners. When you have the map, pretty much all the states from Texas east show that it's you're at greater risk if you're being served through a restructured market. Southeast is doing okay. Is that an argument? Is that there's a structural benefit of having a fully?
I'm not so sure. If you look at the Northwest and
Sure.
the WEC Basin area, those are also
Sure. No,
vertically integrated
I
markets.
certainly get that, but I'm looking at
Yeah.
it when I think about it, not just geographically, but from the population centers. There's obviously a lot more people who live from Texas up and then east. So it's just
Yeah.
curious if there's any
I
problem.
wouldn't draw the conclusion that RTOs are better or worse for reliability than the vertically integrated markets. I think that would be taking this a step too far. I think there are unique circumstances across each of them that merit reflection. One of the other points I'd like to make, though, because Texas is a pretty good example of this, and the same with CERC East area, the Carolinas. One of the other things we got lambasted on social media was that the reserve margin in the Carolinas is about 35%. And people are saying, well, how can you have 35% reserve margins and still be high risk? Well, during the winter storms we saw last month, Carolina was on the verge of interrupting customers. They were in EEA2, ready to go to EEA3, and that's because a lot of the resource there doesn't perform well in the winter. So that's why we've got to get much more surgical in looking really at every hour of the year and the likelihood of resources being available to serve load at that point in time. And the issue with Texas is a resource mix question, right? Most of the stuff going in Texas is solar and batteries. Again, terrific in the summer. So we don't really worry about the Texas summer peak anymore. We used to really worry about that a lot. I worry an awful lot about Texas in January, if that helps.
We definitely have time for a couple more.
Hi, Jim. David Winks. When you talk about large loads, we recently experienced a trip of a large load that cascaded across several others.
Yep.
What would be the best way to help protect the transmission infrastructure and the grid against that type of cascading event?
Keep the loads from tripping off. I mean, it's interesting, David, but it tees up another great observation. One of the issues that we're dealing with is that the grid we inherited is a mass-based grid. It's based on big machines that spin, and the loads are largely motors. Now we're moving towards a grid where most of the resources are integrated through power electronics and inverter, and increasingly the loads coming on the grid, and particularly the truth with data centers, are basically inverter-based loads. The problem with the power electronics is that they respond to things on the grid that mechanical devices can ride through naturally. The power electronics devices don't naturally ride through them, so we've got to get the requirements written and specified. So you have to be able to deal with a voltage fluctuation that looks like this. You got to be able to deal with a frequency deviation of so much. And that's what's missing right now. I mean, we've got it in place now for the inverter generation, at least for the new stuff coming on the grid. One of the reasons we're pushing so hard to get requirements in place for the large loads, the data centers, is so that when they spec out the original equipment, it can comply with this type of requirement. Because otherwise, they all see the same disturbance, and they all act the same way. They say, I'm out. All right? And then you have these massive swings in supplier demand.
Jim, could you give us a little more texture on what you're thinking with respect to the integration of large loads and how reliability should be treated in this rulemaking from FERC or in what states are doing?
Well, I won't weigh in on the FERC state jurisdictional issues because there'll be plenty of people that'll do that. I have three issues that I'm mostly concerned about with large loads, and then I'm sure there are many deviations of this. But the first one is ride-through, that they're able to ride through modest grid disturbances, because modest grid disturbances are going to happen all the time. Right? So we can't have issues like we had in Virginia a couple summers ago where a lightning arrestor fails and we lose 1,700 gigawatts of load, 1,700 megawatts of load. So this ride-through requirement is very, very important. The second one is we need to make sure that the data centers, now I'm using a data center, and that's a very broad term, but it's good enough for now, that the data centers and the load-serving entity are exchanging data such that the data centers can be modeled so that the grid operators don't get surprised. That one thing I've learned in this job is surprising the grid operator is a very bad idea, right? And they live on all the models that they build, so they understand how certain things will happen or what might happen under different conditions. So modeling the loads is very, very important. And then the third thing that's of concern is the security perimeter around these. Particularly, as we start talking about data centers that could reach 1 to 5, I heard this morning from Bill Furman, possibly 10 gigawatts. If a load like that were ever compromised by an adversary, right, and they had the ability to turn it on and off at will, right, the amount of harmonics and oscillations that would create on the grid would become very, very problematic. Now, most of these facilities, given who their owners are probably reasonably secure, right? So I don't know if this is an onerous thing to be talking about with them, but we do want to make sure that the loads themselves are protected from falling into the hands of an adversary. The fourth thing that we're concerned about, we haven't seen any issues along this front yet, though, is particularly data centers that are supporting AI in learning mode have a characteristic that I can only describe as jitteriness, right? Microsecond oscillations up and down, and that will eventually become an issue too. And we'll have to figure out how to attenuate those. And that's probably some application for a battery or something like that. Right. But that's the other, the naturally occurring harmonics associated with the data center, if amplified, could become a real issue for the grid.
So I've got one final question, and I think we should move to the panel. Last week we had an event on what's causing electricity prices to rise in the United States. Because contra my earlier statement looking at multi-decadal price trends, actually in the last few years it's gone up a lot. And one of the things that emerged from that conversation is like a lot of the price increases we're seeing in the United States are driven not by generation choices, less by the transmission build-up, but really like lots of spending on the distribution system, the sort of substation to consumer level. When you think about the reliability question, where should analysts, policymakers, where should our intuition fall on, kind of which segment of the system is most critical to get right in terms of public policy changes or interventions we're going to make?
That's a great question.
I'm good at that.
I want to make let me make one point before I try and answer what you're really asking me. Putting on the cheapest resource is not going to lead to a cheap system. And that's got to be really well understood. I was at an event in Paris last week, the IEA, and it's very clear that a lot of policymakers have drunk the Kool-Aid that all I need to do is put on cheap resources. Solar and wind are the cheapest, so therefore my system's going to be cheap and affordable, but it's not going to be reliable, right? And you got to compare apples to apples. And Lazard does a little bit of a disservice here because when they do their levelized cost of energy assessment, which I think has great value for certain kinds of decisions, they're not very good for system planning. Right? You really got to look at the full suite of reliability characteristics you need and create a soup that meets the needs of customers, which is going to be a reliable and affordable thing. It's got to meet the resources that area has available to deal with, and it's got to be sensitive to the environmental impact that it's creating, and those things need to be balanced. And that's the hard job of policymakers, is to figure out where do I want to spend the extra dollar. Because as I said, if you can build a really cheap system, but it's not going to be reliable and you're not going to like its environmental footprint. You can build a really clean system, probably not going to be reliable, and it's probably not going to be affordable. Or you could build a highly reliable system, and I know you can't afford that, right? So the whole goal of policy is to figure out what are acceptable levels of each of these three dimensions to move forward. Now, to your question, I don't think there's an easy way out of this box. Because, as I said, much of the infrastructure we have in place is old, depreciated. So one of the challenges on rates is we're replacing old capital with new capital. Right. One of the other issues is that we're doing it at a time of relatively high interest rates. So it's very hard for me to find a way out of this box, given where we are with the state of the infrastructure, the need for a lot more stuff to come on the grid. And a lot of that stuff is very expensive. I think right now I was told a gas turbine today costs 3 times as much as one would have cost 3 years ago.
Right.
Those are just the facts.
And as you said, there's this bevy of other investments that have to happen as you grow the gas fleet to a higher and higher proportion of the US generation.
As you add more generation, you need to reinforce the distribution system. You need to reinforce the transmission system. And what nobody's really talking about is we're going to need a lot more gas infrastructure behind that too. Gas storage, more pipe, all that stuff. So it's more than just putting a power plant in the ground.
Right.
You got all the other supportive infrastructure to make it operate reliably.
Right, which and we don't account for that in system costs. Thankfully, the National Petroleum Council and CSIS are both talking about the gas infrastructure need. And we're trying to draw some light to that issue. But colleagues, with your warm applause, please thank Jim for all his hard work. It's a tough job and often a thankless one, but we're really glad you're doing it. Thank you, Jim.